pleasure to be here. Thanks for that introduction. I'm actually retired now, so I don't do any of those things anymore. But I do want to say that I came in for the end of Marty's talk, and then I heard the care consultation talk, and it really made me happy because I first started giving talks on behavior issues and dementia in about 1983 or 1984, and did it obviously for many, many years, and to see people carrying on that work so well is just really great. And also I did care consultation along the way. So I know that Northern Ohio has always been sort of in the forefront of dementia services for quite a long time. And it's really nice to see that it's still continuing. So Sally asked me to talk about wandering, said that there was interest in that. And and she also sent me some of your questions ahead of time. So I tried to build those into the talk. I'm just gonna jump in. Next slide, please, Lindy. I have started this with 3 case studies. I'm gonna read them to you quickly, and then we'll come back and talk about them a little bit later. So Jim is caring for Mary at home. Several times she has walked out of the house in the afternoon while Jim was taking a nap. He is not sure what motivated that behavior, but when he found her, she was very anxious and confused. He wonders if she was hungry or searching for him or bored or trying to go to their old house or something else. So he doesn't know what to do. And all of you who are working directly in this field, I'm sure, have run across a Jim and Mary along the way. Next slide, please. John lives in a nursing home where he's been for several years. His dementia is quite progressed and he no longer speaks coherently. For many hours every day, John walks the halls, mumbling as he goes and touching things along the way. Staff have trouble getting him to sit down long enough to eat or rest. Sometimes he walks into other resident rooms and touches their things. What should staff do? And I will say that I have worked over the years as a consultant in assisted living and in nursing homes. And this is, as some of you know, I'm sure, is a very common kind of behavior. Thanks. Next, please. Sophie has Alzheimer's disease and is currently in the hospital after a severe fall. She keeps getting out of bed and walking painfully and slowly down the hall. The staff wonder, is she trying to go home, searching for the bathroom, looking for her sister, something else? What should they do? Next slide, please. So, as you noticed, I labeled this walking, wandering, pacing, etc. You know, these behaviors, and it's more than one behavior, it's many behaviors, and it's not the same from person to person, but they've been lumped under the label of wandering for 40 years. And I think at times that does a disservice in a lot of ways. First of all, the term wandering is a pretty negative one, and it implies purposelessness and aimlessness, which is not always the case, as we'll talk about in a minute. The Alzheimer's Association says that about 60% of people with dementia wander. And I have to say, I think that sometimes the Alzheimer's Association works to scare people. And while I think that that statistic is important, I think there are different ways of delivering that information. So thinking about the words we use is important. Accommodating versus eliminating. This kind of behavior, and as I say, it's multiple behaviors, is sometimes impossible to eliminate. It often doesn't work trying to get rid of it. So What does accommodation require? Well, the first thing with all behaviors, and I think Marty spoke to this, is understanding the behavior. You really have to start by being a detective and figuring out what is motivating this behavior. Next slide, please. As I say, it's not just one behavior. So here are some of the possible causes of the behaviors that are lumped under the title wandering. Excuse me. Walking for exercise. I don't know about you all, but I am a walker, and if I have dementia, I'm likely to be someone who will walk a lot. Looking for the bathroom, looking for something, food or drink or some other unmet need. And then certainly I think that those are often motivations behind this kind of behavior. Walking to get someplace, really having in mind a place they want to get to. And as we know, very often that may be wanting to get back to a place where they think they still live and maybe don't anymore. Excuse me, I'm having some trouble with my voice. Always a person who was restless. When I put this in, or when I look at this, I think about my sister, who is very restless. One of those people who sits and is swinging her leg or doing something all the time. She's up and about. She doesn't sit still. And I think people who have been like that often are motivated to move because of this restlessness that may be a lifelong behavior. Walking to escape from an unpleasant situation or environment, and this can happen anywhere. It may be in a family home where there's a lot of tension or too many people or too much noise, loud music. It may be in assisted living. It may be in a nursing home, maybe in the hospital, where people are trying to escape. Walking from boredom or loneliness or anxiety, I think these are all motivating emotions that may be behind this kind of behavior in some cases. Or it might be a pattern from earlier in life. One of the many examples of this I heard of was many years ago. A man who was in a nursing home, and after lunch, he would get up and try and get out of the building every day. And finally, someone thought to ask his wife about what was happening when he lived at home. And she said they lived in a house with a very long driveway. And every day after lunch, he would walk down the driveway to get the mail. So it appeared that he was reenacting that pattern from earlier in life. And because this was an enlightened staff, they made a mailbox for him at the one end of the building and worked with him to get him to walk and get papers out of that mailbox so that he could continue to replay that pattern instead of trying to leave the building. So this is just by way of saying that you really have to try and be a detective, figure out what the possible cause is of the behavior you're seeing, and the interventions follow from that. Next slide, please. Some researchers have divided these behaviors into two kinds: goal-directed movement, where the person has a purpose in mind that directs his or her movement. And I just gave you some examples of that. These appear to often be people who are worried. They're worried about doing a task or getting to a place to do the task, maybe needing to pick the kids up from school or needing to make dinner or whatever it is. or they're worried about a relative, a spouse or children or siblings or parents who may be long dead, but not in that person's mind. And according to some research that's been done, this is most frequently seen, these kind of behaviors, first thing in the morning. And that makes sense to me. If someone wakes up and they're disoriented, they're not sure where they are, they may at that point try and replay their early morning patterns from earlier in life. Late afternoon, that's often when another labeled behavior, sundowning, kicks in. And it's often when people would be going home from work or going to pick up their children or some other task. And also it's a time when people are often more fatigued and more likely to become anxious. And the middle of the night is the third place where apparently this is seen a lot. And I think it's very likely that some people wake up in the middle of the night, don't know where they are, may think it's time to get up, may think it's morning, and get up and start moving around. Next slide, please. Random movement is the other category that these people came up with. And it includes pacing and so-called aimless wandering, where people are just moving around and don't appear to be goal-oriented. It's often a response to anxiety or physical discomfort. When I've been a consultant in residential settings, I and staff often looked at the patterns. And like with any behavior, one of the most helpful things you can do is keep a log and really journal when this is happening and look at it over a series of days so that you can get an idea of when it's happening, where it's happening, who's around, what's going on. That sometimes can give you clues about what is the motivation here. So it may be that the physical discomfort is someone having to go to the bathroom and not being able to find the bathroom, or they're in pain and they're walking because it's painful. Person could just be bored or restless. And this random kind of movement tends to happen anytime or any place. It isn't as orderly, although with any given individual it might be. Again, keeping a log can be really helpful. Often these folks are farther along in the disease process as well. And I would say that usually they can't really articulate what is going on with them. Next slide, please. So interventions depend on the motivation for the behavior and the location. Let's go back to Jim and Mary. Jim's caring for Mary at home. Several times she's left the house in the afternoon while Jim is taking a nap. So what should he do? Could we have the next slide, please? When I work with families, I always encourage them to keep a log. And then we work together to come up with a list of possible reasons for the behavior. And then we test out different strategies. And sometimes what happens is that a strategy may work one day and not the next day. And then I encourage people to come up with a list of strategies that have worked sometimes and keep them somewhere on the refrigerator or somewhere where they can refer to them when a behavior happens and, oh, I need to try something. So one possibility for Jim might be to give her a snack before his nap. Maybe she's hungry. Maybe she's looking for food. He could try getting her to rest with him. She may be fatigued as well, but we know that confusion and disorientation tend to increase when people are fatigued. He could try going for a walk with her or taking her for a drive before that time of day. And for some people, that really settles them down. Putting on music or an old movie or something she loves. If there is something that still engages her, trying to engage her. Obviously, he could skip his naps, but we all know that caregivers get really tired and really need breaks themselves. So Jim also will need to think about safety measures, and I'll talk about some of those in a few minutes. That is not an exhaustive list, but those are just some of the possible things he might try, depending on what he thinks might be the reasons behind her behavior. Next slide, please. This is John walking in the nursing home. What should staff do? Next slide, please. Well, here is accommodation versus elimination. These people like John who are walking incessantly around wherever they are, it's often impossible to eliminate that behavior unless you restrain them, which you're not supposed to do, and that can often have its own set of safety problems, not to mention ethical problems. So I would start in this situation with, again, having the staff kind of log this and figure out where are the problems and when are the problems. If John isn't really hurting anything, it may not be an issue, but if he's not eating and he's not sitting down long enough, I have a very vivid memory of being a consultant in a nursing home in Dearborn many years ago. And there was a man like this, and he was losing weight. They could not get him to sit for meals. And so we decided to try giving him finger foods while he was walking. And that worked pretty well. I also discovered by spending time in the dining room with him that the dining room in that nursing home was incredibly noisy. There were a lot of people in a small space. There were trays and silverware and staff, and it was just really noisy. I suggested that we try putting him in a small room by himself or maybe with one other person and see if he would sit and eat. And actually many days he would when we instituted that plan. So thinking about how food is handled obviously is important. Adequate hydration is always important. People with dementia typically forget at some point to drink. And it's something I always caution caregivers about, thinking how to get liquid of some kind down them. And with somebody who is an incessant walker like John, it's even more important because dehydration can happen quickly. I would find out if he enjoys music. When I was director of the Silver Club Adult Day program, we had a woman who got very agitated at a certain time of day and would start pacing. And she couldn't really tell us exactly what she needed, but we discovered that in her case, a recliner with headphones with Nat King Cole, who was her favorite singer, really calmed her down. And she would sit for an hour or so. When she was sitting there, we put a screen behind her so she couldn't see or hear anybody else. And it gave her a chance to relax and be off her feet for a little while. Doesn't always work, but sometimes that's really helpful. Or there may be old hobbies that some piece of it could engage John for a short time, just to give him even 10 minutes off his feet. So some of the health and safety issues with someone like John, wander guards obviously are things that are sometimes used in residential care, and sometimes families use some version of that. Alarms on exits, monitoring exits. It's important to make sure the person has good footwear and that it fits well and that their feet aren't covered with blisters or cracked skin, which I've seen in people, particularly in nursing homes in the past. Maybe it's better now, I don't know. But I've seen people with really damaged feet who continued to walk, and really their feet needed attention. Trying to figure out how to get the person to rest a bit is important. Sometimes places use Velcro strips across doorways or stop signs on resident doors and sometimes it's just a particular room or two where the person goes into. I would certainly ask staff in this situation, how easy is it to redirect him? And how can that be handled on a regular basis? Next slide, please. I want to just talk for a second about agitation, because that is a really common feature of dementia for a lot of people, and we particularly see it in that kind of behavior, walking that John exhibited. So again, evaluating the situation, I think Marty talked about the importance of describing a behavior accurately. Agitation can mean a lot of things, and it may be used as sort of a global label, but that doesn't really define the behavior. And then obviously you create strategies based on possible causes. This is a definition of agitation from Yitka Cohen-Mansfield. I think I forgot to put this particular reference in your PowerPoint, but Yitka Cohen-Mansfield is one of several people who's done a great deal of work in this area of agitated behaviors in nursing homes and in the field of wandering. Donna Algase is another person like that. Agitation in persons with dementia is manifested in a wide variety of verbal and physical behaviors that deviate from social norms, including irrelevant vocalizations, screaming, cursing, restlessness, wandering, strange movements, and handling things inappropriately. So you can see that's a lot of different behaviors. That's why describing behaviors really accurately is important. And when I've done staff meetings with staff, and we try and define behaviors that we're seeing in someone, it's very interesting what a range of descriptions we get, because not everyone is defining the behavior the same way. So we always started with that. Next slide, please. Also, it's really important to look at environmental causes of these kinds of behaviors. There can be such a thing as sensory overload, too many people, too much noise, TV, too much clutter, no cues. By no cues, I mean nothing in the environment that tells the person what they're supposed to do or where things are or what is going on. I think this is particularly a problem in residential care. And I remember a man I worked with in the 1980s in a memory care unit who would get very angry when he hit a point of sensory overload, and he would start cursing and yelling and rattling his newspaper, waving his cane around. And we learned to look for the clues that he was getting to a breaking point and get him out of that environment. So that was important. On the other end is sensory deprivation, environments that are boring, where there's nothing of interest to engage the person in the environment. And that also can cause agitation. If you think about yourself being in, say, a doctor's waiting room or the emergency room waiting room, where there is nothing to engage your interest, it's hard not to get agitated, or it adds to agitation that may already be there. Also, a tense emotional environment, which could be anywhere, could be at home, could be in residential care, People with dementia often are extremely sensitive to the emotional environment, even if they can't articulate that. Next slide, please. Hospitals. Sophie is the person in the hospital who is walking down the hall, and staff are a little worried about her. Next slide, please. So hospitals, I have put a, at the end of the PowerPoint, I have a couple of resources, and one of them is a link to a really good fact sheet about hospitals and what happens to people with dementia in hospitals, and then strategies. And there are many of them, so many strategies. So I've only pulled out a couple of things here to think about. But hospitals, if they have this option, which obviously many times they don't, need to think about room and bed placement of patients with dementia. And I know that some years ago, there was a movement of some hospitals to develop special areas for people who were confused or had a diagnosis of dementia. I don't think that's happened very widely, unfortunately. They could control noise and other environmental issues better if they did that, but hospital beds, as you know, are often in short supply, and it's sort of a revolving door. If they have someone with dementia who is getting out of bed, staff need to be really mindful of where the exits are, and it's helpful if the person has to go past a nursing station in order to get to exits. Many times they use motion sensors on chairs or beds so they know if the person is getting up, or wander guards on ankles or wrists. Instituting regular checks is important. And I think, you know, over the years, I've counseled a lot of families who've had really bad experiences in hospitals. So if a person, when I'm working with families, I always really try and caution them before it's needed to think about what happens in emergency rooms, what happens in hospitals, how to handle a situation if somebody becomes acutely ill or injured. Many families end up spending 24/7 to keep the person as under control as possible. Sometimes hospitals can assign companions, but I think COVID has disrupted all of those things in most hospitals. When my mother was in the hospital and had some delirium as well as some mild dementia, I spent, I don't know, 12, 15 hours with her the first day. She had fallen and broken something. And when I came back early the next morning, they had her wrists tied to the bed rails, which I didn't really think they did that anymore, but this was only 5, 6 years ago. And at the hospital she was in, they did that, which of course she was lying there screaming, and it only made everything worse. Next slide, please. So there are risks associated with walking or with wandering. These are just a few, and it depends somewhat on what location people are in, but falls can happen anywhere. And that is something, you know, when I've had families whose relatives are falling at home and they're saying, well, I have to move him because then he won't fall. Obviously, people fall anywhere. They fall in adult day programs, in assisted living, in memory care, in nursing homes. We can't always totally prevent that. We do what we can, but that is a risk. Fatigue, I have mentioned a little bit. Dehydration, I think I've mentioned. Leaving the premises obviously is a risk, and something that people need to think about depending on the stage the person is in. Some people can still go for walks safely for quite a while in early and even early middle stages of dementia. getting lost or missing, and sometimes we have all heard stories of people who have died. Those are the horrible stories. I recently did have a counseling client whose husband was gone for about 9 hours, and it turned out he had walked to the next town, which is 12 miles away. And he had become incontinent along the way, and he had not taken his phone or his wallet, and he went into a restaurant, and these people were very kind. He could remember his wife's phone number, so that was a blessing, and they were able to call her. He smelled terrible, and the fact that they even let him in there was a great kindness on their part. And then bothering others, particularly in residential care, that's often a risk. Next slide, please. So a few of many things that can be done here. Having a recent photo of the person available. I always tell families to do that no matter what stage they're at. When people go on outings, or even if the person is going out for a walk alone, having bright clothing or a bright hat or something. I had one client whose husband always wore a red baseball hat when they went anywhere, and she could spot him easily if they got separated. That was really helpful. Monitoring fluids, we've talked about. Checking shoes and feet, we've talked about. Trying to institute a rest time, I think, if it's possible, is important. People with dementia, we know, get often much more exhausted. It takes them more time and more energy to process everything, to process language, to process the environment, to just get through the day, to take a bath. Any of those things can be exhausting. And so if there is a built-in rest time for many people, that is really helpful. Obviously, locks or alarms on doors may be important. Signs, I didn't put that in, but sometimes signs are very effective at stopping people. And then thinking about what technology is possible, and these are just a few. Next slide, please. Some nighttime walking strategies. It really depends on where the person is. If they're home with a single caregiver, nighttime walking can be really a challenge. And some of the things I always talk to families about are securing the doors and anything that might be a risk, cleaning fluids, knives, whatever, anything that could be unsafe should be secured. Working on an exercise regime during the day, so perhaps the person won't need to walk as much at night. Looking at so-called sleep hygiene issues, time they go to bed, what they're doing before bed, whether they're hungry in the middle of the night, making sure the person can find the bathroom and that there's adequate light, both to get to the bathroom, but also any place else the person may be walking. Sometimes really people need to ask a physician about safe sleep aids if nothing else is working. I have had caregivers in the last few years who I've worked with who were up and down themselves all night. One of my recent clients had to, her husband would get up in the night, walk all over the house and go through cupboards, and he'd be touching things and naming things. And but he would also come into her bedroom and wake her up. And she put a lock on the door and he broke it. She pushed a bureau against the bedroom door. I think that's currently what she's doing. He is safe apparently in the house, but he won't let her sleep. And when their son visits and is sleeping, he also wakes the son up all night long. So this is clearly a huge issue for people at home. And I think these kinds of things often precipitate moves to residential care. And that is something she's investigating right now. By other places, I mean residential care or, whatever kind of residential care it is. I always ask when I'm visiting memory care units or assisted living or nursing homes where there are people with memory loss, what do you do when people are up walking at night? And to me, a good place accommodates rather than trying to force people back to bed. I've known memory care units where they had a staff member who would give a snack to the person or just sit and talk to them or make them cocoa or some hot drink. But not every place does that. A lot of places still try and force people to stay in bed all night. And that is not accommodation. And honestly, particularly in memory care units, I don't consider that good care. Next slide, please. A few safety options that I put down. The Alzheimer's store, you're probably familiar with. They have currently a lot of tracking watches for older people. So there are a lot of different options for watches or jewelry that people can wear that have GPS tracking available in locations where that would work. Apple watches, I have recently known several people with dementia who are wearing Apple watches, and one of the men, even though he's well into the middle stages, can call his wife on the Apple Watch just by talking to it. And the GPS has been kind of a lifesaver. That's the man who walked 12 miles. So he now has an Apple Watch, which he wears. The Alzheimer's Association and Medical Alert still have the program for registering people in case they get lost. And I looked up whether Project Lifesaver was in your area, and it is, and I'm hoping that most of you know about it already. And it sounds like the sheriff's departments in your counties are well on board. I think that's it, except for the 2 resource slides. Next slide, please. This top link is the Wandering and Hospitalized Older Patients handout. It's a 2-page flyer. My book, which I'm told you're familiar with, Coping with Behavior Change in Dementia. And I don't know if you're familiar with the other book that Laurie and I wrote more recently, which is called Moving a Relative and Other Transitions in Dementia Care. So we talk in this book about finding home care, using day programs, safety, how the brain works in terms of insight and what happens with insight, making the decision to move into residential care, things to think about before, during, and after the move. And we also talk a little bit about hospice care in there. I realize I did not put our website on there, but it's dementiacarebooks.com. But you can also buy both of those books on Amazon. And through our website, we sell copies over the quantity of 25 at a reduced rate. And then the last slide, I think, is some of the academic research